So Longlegs had been hyped up to me as one of the best horror films ever made, so I knew I had to see it as soon as I saw how well it was doing after that. And I got to the theater last week and strapped in for what was supposedly the most exciting horror film of the decade, but before going any further, I must emphasize that if you don't want to get spoiled on this film, you should honestly click out the video and see it for yourself. If you're going to find enjoyment from this film, it is best to go into it completely blind, so please do not go any further in this video if you haven't seen it yet. Also, everything in here is just my opinion on the film. Many people find themselves enjoying this one, and while I'm genuinely a fan of the Neon and A24 spheres of horror, this one left me with a lot of thoughts and feelings, so let's continue on with the actual review. Let's start with the parts of the film that I liked. First off, the film's visuals. Every scene in the film was shot in a way that made it look like it was a painting. I don't find myself saying that a lot about films, as getting every single shot to look that way takes extreme talent, but I think the cinematographer Andres Arrochi really outdid himself with this film. I really can't emphasize enough just how beautiful this film is visually. I compare it to the combination of simplicity and symmetry of Wes Anderson and the juxtaposition and framing of Robert Eggers. The visual influences of Silence of the Lambs are also extremely apparent, with the shots of the film looking like they could have been shown side by side with the Silence of the Lambs in the best of ways. Like, I seriously cannot emphasize enough just how pretty this film is to look at. Every single frame looks like something that you could just hang on your wall. It's such a pretty film. And from a cinematography perspective, I would put it onto the same level as the Robert Eggers stuff, as it's just so good to look at. Like, there's not just the story to focus on, the visuals themselves are just so interesting on their own. And that really takes a lot, as the visuals are such a hard thing to master, and for the way that this film uses visuals, it has it down to a T. And the film very much wears its influence on its sleeve, which is not a bad thing whatsoever. The director clearly had a vision for what he wanted the film to look like throughout, and there's not an ounce of wasted space on screen. If you look at the background, there's always something for you to be looking at. It's not just empty space, which we have a problem with in a lot of the newer horror films. There always seems to be something lurking in the background behind the main character, and it's really going to make it fun to watch on subsequent viewings, I believe, because there's just so much in the background to see. And that's something I really love about horror films, because I know Hereditary did it very well with a lot of little stuff in the background, and it reminded me a lot of that. So if you find yourself not interested in the story itself, the visuals themselves are interesting enough to keep you entertained on their own. And the film's introduction is one of the best and creepiest things I've seen in a while, keeping the face of the man creeping on this little girl just out of frame, where we can see just the bottom half of his face. Yeah, we can tell just on acting alone just how mentally disturbed this man is, as he just seems to be creeping on this little girl, and he just doesn't act right. And leading into that, the acting in this film was great, as every scene with Nicolas Cage just felt highly off-putting. With every time he appears on screen, you expect him to snap at any second. Leading into that, the first 40 minutes of the film really hooked me in, with many points of it feeling on par with many of my other favorite horror films of the past few years, with just how well it can hold tension. One of my favorite parts of the film happened in the first 20 minutes, with Lee going home trying to solve the case when suddenly she hears a loud slamming on her door and sees a figure outside watching her. As soon as I saw this scene, I was hooked immediately, as we know now that whoever the killer is knows who she is and is actively messing with our main character. But this is where a lot of the positives I have with the film end, as while I was able to keep myself enthralled for the first 40 minutes, the same can't be said for the rest of the film for me, as while the majority of the early parts of the film we only really see glimpses of Nicolas Cage, once we get a full reveal of the character, a lot of the fear that comes along with the story goes along with it. Now, this isn't to say that the reveal itself is the problem, but this is the transition point of the story for me, where it went from a tight, put together story to a disappointing mess. I don't say this lightly, as I really was going to this film as blind as possible. I had been avoiding almost all the material surrounding the film, so my expectations of the film are relatively low besides what some friends and critics were saying about the film. But nothing could have prepared me for just how much the film changed in such a short amount of time. The film's tension in the first half from the mystery of the Longlegs killer gets immediately vaporized when we meet the mother, with the twist of the film being incredibly obvious due to the heavy amounts of foreshadowing that it almost comes off as insulting. Nearly as if the audience wasn't going to be able to pick up any of the hints surrounding the twist unless they spelled it out specifically to us. For example, when within the mother's house with the final twist, once again, if you are trying to avoid spoilers, click off now. We see a cockroach crawl out from underneath the basement door and a hard pan on the door, which is later revealed to be the exact spot where the mother was keeping Longlegs to make the dolls for her to deliver to the other parents to get their parents to kill themselves and their kids. Throughout the film, they keep saying that there must be some sort of accomplice, therefore it's so pronounced that no other possible character could have been the accomplice rather than the mother. Still, the film feels the need to spell it out in any way possible, which I think ruined the twist for me because it would have been way more interesting if they had let it instead flow in the natural direction that the story was going into, giving the reveal that much more weight than it ended up actually having. The movie didn't seem to trust its audience to understand what was happening with the story and left much less to the imagination than should have been probably put on the table. For example, Hereditary is one of my favorite horror films of the past 10 years, still it has the same issue near the end where it over-explains the horror of what's happening to this family. However, Hereditary leaves way more room for interpretation than this film does. The film falls apart specifically in Act 3 because this is where it gets to the point where it feels the need to explain every single detail so far as if we were children. It literally gets to the point where they just straight up start telling you every single thing that you need to understand, not visually, but through a long-winded voiceover, essentially going point by point on every single thing that we needed to know within the film, completely dragging me out of the experience that I was enthralled with up to the third act. One of the main rules of filmmaking is show, don't tell, so I wonder why they thought it was a good idea to explain what was going on that way instead of just showing us what we needed to know visually. This is even more egregious in my mind because they show what we needed to see while she delivers the monologue. What in the world was the point of the voiceover if you're just gonna show it anyways? It's just completely useless and it adds nothing to the film. It just feels like you're treating us like children. It just came across like one of those explain videos, not something that just needed to be within the film. The scene would have worked so much better if we had just seen the twist by itself with no added narration, as it just left us with more to think about than the narration allows. I really tried to get back into the movie after this point because that completely dragged me out of it. Still, there was no getting back into the narrative at this point as the plot seemingly crashes and burns in the last 20 minutes in spectacular fashion. The film doesn't leave any questions besides the multiple loose ends that seemingly go nowhere, like why Longlegs picked the Harker family. Yes, Lee's birthday is the 14th, but Longlegs' MO throughout the film is getting the fathers to kill their whole family. However, the Harker family doesn't have a family figure of that kind, making it not work. The only possible interpretation I can make that would make sense would be that he could fill in that role himself and use Ruth as an accomplice, but that wouldn't make sense either, because it shows the mother being overtaken by the demon just like all the fathers before her. But instead of doing what they did, she gives herself up to save her daughter and makes a deal with the devil in order to keep things going. But it's not like the other A24 explosion films of indie horror, where I had to genuinely research what was going on to understand it. The film is relatively easy to follow, which is a breath of fresh air compared to some of the other more strange horror films in the horror space as of right now, as it seems like almost every new indie horror film is trying to be the new Astor, Eggers, or Flanagan. Still, I just don't think the plot worked. I found it much more enjoyable when it was just a weird serial killer that has no motivations or remorse, just getting the father to commit familicide, and that a lot of the horror is lost when it's given a more concrete explanation the devil made them do it. It would have been much scarier if it was just more unexplained about how he did it, as the answer is not as intriguing as the question itself. And that is how a lot of the film felt to me, as it seemed to be trying to tick all the boxes of its contemporaries and was more of a blob of its influence rather than having an identity of its own, as it felt like it was just trying to combine the horrors of Hereditary, Sinister, and Silence of the Lambs into one film, but forgot to truly make something its own. Now, that's not me saying that the film is unoriginal. That's one of the praises I will give it. It's definitely not like many of the horror films that have come out recently. And with all that being said, I wouldn't necessarily say that I hated this film, but would I say I need to own it or see it right now? Probably not. The film is just fine. It's not bad, it's not good, it's just fine. And I hate saying that because the film seemed heavily up my alley. I love a lot of the other horror films in this style, as I think this new wave of horror pushing against the Blumhouse jump scare style we have seen for a while is exciting and keeps the horror genre feeling fresh and original. And I love films like Silence of the Lambs and Seven. Still, I just don't think that the film combined well with the more modern style of horror, as those films are more like psychological thrillers over everything else, and the combination of the horror genre techniques here doesn't really work for me. But I will say this film made me excited to see what Oz Perkins could come up with next, because I think this film shows exceptional potential of how good he could be as a horror director. But I know I'll probably get a lot of people pushing back against this video. But to show you just how I got the rating I got to, on the technical aspects, I would give it about a 9 out of 10, as the technicality of the film is outstanding, but if I was just giving it a score for the story, it would be a 3 out of 10, as I thought the story completely flatlined after the first 40 minutes, and just to give more emphasis to the story due to that being what people actually come back for after its release, it evens out to a 5 out of 10 for me. I don't regret watching the film, and I recommend you watch it for yourself if you haven't, even though if you're watching this video, you most likely have. And to me, this was more of a divisive one than I expected to be. And this has been ABA Short Films, and I'll see you all next week.